Well, let's talk a little bit here, just a little bit about the U.S. Meat Export Federation. It's a fairly young organization, started in 1976. We get our funding from a number of different sources: membership dues, private contributions, and then primarily the checkoffs. All of them, beef, pork, and lamb, soybeans, and corn all contribute market dollars. We call those private dollars or industry dollars, and then also they're matched with funding that comes out of the Foreign Ag Service of USDA. Primary programs are the Market Access Program, emerging markets, and foreign market development programs. They're an important partner and really help us accomplish our mission. MEF's mission is fundamentally we're focused on enhancing demand for U.S. pork and beef and lamb products in all the export markets. And as I go through this presentation, I'll give you some specific examples of how we approach that challenge in new and developing and established markets. Our membership, we currently have more than 230 members that represent 9 industry segments. That makes USMEF the most vertically integrated trade association in the meat and livestock industry, and it gives us a broad representation of all segments that have a stake in the success of U.S. beef and pork exports. The starting point, really, for everything we do is our international office network, which gives the U.S. industry an on-the-ground presence in all the major export markets around the world. As you can see from the map, we have 12 international offices and 3 regional consultants, and we're running programs in more than 30 countries around the world, and overall we touch with programs and development programs in more than 80 nations around the globe. The 60 or so USMEF employees overseas are your representatives in the international markets and are really the foundation for everything we do at USMEF. Well, let's talk a little bit about pork specifically, my favorite topic, being a pork producer, and we've really got quite a story to tell. This chart graphically shows the opportunity for U.S. pork exports. While U.S. pork consumption is projected to grow only 13% from 95 through 2016, consumption in the rest of the world is expected to increase by nearly 2/3. The United States has capitalized on this trend in a big way. The U.S. is the world's largest pork exporter, with 22% of all our pork going into overseas markets. U.S. pork growth has been just phenomenal. It's almost hard for me to believe, even being that close to it. But we've more than doubled exports since the year 2000. A number of milestones here in 95. We became for the first time a net pork exporter. In 95, finally exported that year more pork than we brought into the country, and we've seen substantial growth since. In 2008, we had another record year. We were up 57% in volume, just a huge increase, 55% in value, up to almost $5 billion. It was the second consecutive record year for pork exports. Every year for 17 years in a row, we've exported a new record amount every year. So it's really quite a story to tell. Exports added over $42 per head to the price of a pig in 2008, and over 24% of U.S. production was exported. Exports really are important to the bottom line. 1 in 3 pounds of pork traded in the world comes from the United States, and we export the equivalent of almost 50,000 hogs every day. That's a huge business. And in 2008, exports added $42.31 per head, as I mentioned before, into the value of each and every hog marketed, and that's compared to just $29.16 back in 2007. Pork export growth really grew from a number of places around the world. The U.S. saw phenomenal growth, up 49% in pork muscle meats last year. The EU also had substantial gains along with Canada. Some slight decreases in Brazil and Chile. Some currency effects. The real was pretty strong last year in Brazil. Chile suffered some problems with interruptions in exports due to some chemical contaminations, and even Mexico is starting to become a player in pork exports. They have a free trade agreement with Japan and have a slight advantage of us over the U.S. in a duty, but they tend to export more high-value products like pork loins. On the importing side, Japan is the number one importer and saw good growth in total imports. The big news, though, was Hong Kong, China, and Russia. China and Hong Kong especially up 169% last year. Just phenomenal growth, a large amount of that. We saw our exports out of the U.S. grow substantially there also. Russia was also another big exporter. We saw some decreases in Korea. U.S. exports or U.S. imports into the country declined also. The ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian nations, showed good export growth. Even Canada was up. Australia was up, and actually Australia is really becoming quite a good export market, even for the United States now, even more substantially than we initially thought, due to the free trade agreement we have with them and the completion of their risk assessment. On the production side, in 2009, we're forecasting increases in production in China and Brazil and Russia that are offset by a decline in exports to the EU, the US, and Canada. China's production is still not fully recovered from the peak that it hit in 2006, but they are putting a pretty substantial effort into building the industry in that country. There's going to be some differences in 2009. Certainly there's going to be growing production in China. There's still going to be market access issues in Russia and a difficult economic situation. Both countries are going to see increased domestic production. We're going to have sustained demand probably from Mexico and Japan, and I hope that they're going to be the bright spots in 2009. But we're still going to have some continued currency impact in Mexico and Russia because of the devaluation of their currencies. It makes U.S. pork prices, this says down, it should be U.S. pork prices are actually up or higher priced because of the currency effects. The peso is about 15 to 1. It just makes all the things they import more expensive. China and Hong Kong, as I mentioned, were the big news in 2008. Saw record pork imports into the country. And still today, in February of 2009, their live hog market prices were about $84 a hundredweight, which is still traditionally pretty high, but it's about 25% below the record prices set last April. They are increasing their production. In September last year, their live hog industry was up 6.6% from the prior year, and their sow population is up pretty substantially too, 12.4%, and total meat production in China is also rising, is up 6%. Russia is the second largest pork muscle cut importer behind Japan. It was really surprising. We saw even substantial imports, over 300,000 metric tons went in over the quota. They have a tariff rate quota system where they have a tariff rate quota which was a little under 500,000 metric tons in 2008, but anything exported or brought in over that pays a pretty substantial duty, which is 60%. So there was, even in spite of that 60% duty, there was a substantial amount of pork that went in there over that. We've got a little higher quota in 2009, and especially in the U.S. we went for the U.S. we went up to 100,000 metric tons for our quota, where we were just a little under 50,000 metric tons in 2008. So, and we think we got a good chance to fill that quota and do so at a sharply reduced tariff. So things could look pretty good, at least from the U.S. standpoint, in 2009. We're still going to face the problems with the weakness of the ruble, and the Russians seem to continually have a lot of issues, supposed sanitary issues, and we have a lot of problems with delisted plants and with changing regulations. And I think you can continue to look for continued growth in their domestic production that's going to be subsidized by the government. Well, let's talk about beef a little bit. Looking at 2008 beef consumption, the story is much the same as with pork, with projections for domestic production being relatively flat from 95 through 2016, and once again the export market is really where the opportunities lie. The U.S. beef industry export goal for 2011 is 3 billion pounds, and in 2003 exports were 2.81 billion pounds. And then obviously in 2004 we're impacted substantially by the finding of BSE in this country. We're projecting 2010 exports to be about 2.7 billion. From a historic view, U.S. beef exports have recovered about 60% of the 03 export volume in 2007. And beef exports, just like in the pork side, really impact the bottom line. 11.6% of all beef and variety meats produced in the U.S. in 08 were exported. The value of those exports equated to $133 for every head slaughtered in 08, and for comparison that total in 07 was about $95. But even with the limitations on U.S. beef exports to Japan, which was our top beef export market in 03, total U.S. beef and variety meat exports in 08 reached 77% of 03 levels in volume and amounted to 94% of the value of exports in that peak export year. Cost of BSE to the U.S. beef industry has been substantial. Let's look at how much was lost due to the market interruptions caused by the discovery of BSE in the United States in December of 03. In the 5-year period of 04 through 07, the loss of export market opportunities has been estimated at $10.3 billion. The impact from Japan has accounted for more than half of that, roughly $6 billion or 100 million per month. Even though we are steadily rebuilding beef exports to 03 levels, that $10 billion is money we'll never recover. 08 was another great year for exports. We were up about 28% in volume, 38% in value, $3.6 billion. It was about 94% of the pre-BSE levels. So export markets and we're really up in almost all the leading markets. Looking at beef exporters, Brazil had some decreases in exports last year, primarily from they had strong domestic demand within the country and drops in production, and their currency was pretty strong, which led to that decrease in exports. The U.S. saw substantial growth in exports out of this country. It was really the largest of any of the major exporters, and we continue to actually had overall tight beef supplies and high prices through most of 08 that led that ability to export. We're forecasting in 09 and increases in production in China, Brazil, and Russia, offset with a decline in exports to the EU, the US, and Canada. China's production is still not fully recovered from its peak in 2006. Another challenging environment in 2009 for beef. We're forecasting a small year-to-year export increase. Exports to most of the top markets will slip slightly, but the real keys are, and the real unknowns are in South Korea, Japan, and in Greater China. What happens in those markets is going to be key to the final outcome for 09. We've been through some tough industry times, and I think we've learned some lessons. I want to talk about some of the challenges we've had in exports. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about BSE. We still face restrictions in Japan and limited supplies because we have a restriction. We can only export beef from animals that are 20 months of age and younger. It really limits the supply. The U.S. has taken a tactic of trying to really ship all beef from all cattle and all ages, and I think a lot of the importing countries seem to be pretty resistant to that. even though that would be certainly allowed under the OIE's controlled risk classification, which the U.S. has. I think if we're going to make any big changes in the exports there, we're going to have to go to a step approach where we can start shipping beef maybe from cattle 30 months of age or younger, with eventually trying to get to the shipping beef from all cattle and all ages. In Korea, we do have market access there, but it's been after going through what I think was probably one of the biggest PR debacles of all time was in opening that market. It's still a real challenge just from a sales standpoint. There's still a lot of consumer resistance to U.S. beef in Korea. I think we've learned that the markets are really very slow to reopen. I think too often we assume that they have to have our product, and I think it's been demonstrated pretty much that they don't. They really don't. They do have other alternatives. I think we need to listen to some of the qualified sources and people that understand the cultures in those markets, and try to adjust our marketing and our regulations and our intentions to the cultures that we're trying to sell product to. I think it's pretty well demonstrated that these sanitary and phytosanitary principles are really no match when you've got a public opinion crisis at hand. Secondly, we've been involved with a dispute with the EU on hormoned beef for now more than a decade, almost 2 decades now. We've had some success in the Codex and in the WTO, but just the philosophy of how the Europeans deal with this and the use of their precautionary principle has really been a test of this, trying to implement things for the new technology. Now, in the closing days of the Bush administration, they implemented a thing called carousel retaliation, where they rotate the products that are retaliated against with increased duties. I think it's really caught the interest of the Europeans, and they seem lately to be a little more willing to negotiate, so hopefully we'll have some good news coming out of there soon. But some of the lessons I think we've learned that once again, it's the cultural thing. We've got 2 different cultures. It's science and the politics just have to be right if these things are if we're going to solve these problems. And there's certainly, I think we've learned that there's limitations on the WTO dispute settlement framework. It's really a pretty slow and at times ineffective process to get trade started again. Another problem we've had on the pork side is with ractopamine or paline, the trade name. It's not approved for use in the EU or China or Taiwan, so it causes some problems with exporting into those countries. They're working through the process, and they're getting down to some of the final steps in the Codex to get it approved. But we've had to make arrangements for shipping ractopamine free pork to China and the EU, which has caused some disruptions in the ability to export also. I think some of the lessons we learned is, I guess in some of the emerging markets like China, when they need your product, as they did last year, that just about anything seems possible, but at times you can suffer some repercussions also. But also that certainly agriculture is a global industry, and different regulations in different countries are going to have major impacts. So what's next? I think we've got a lot of other things on the horizon, certainly ethical issues like environment and animal welfare and nutrition, biotechnology and cloning. There's going to be issues in the future along with traceability. The international standards, the minimum residue levels, the varying standards across the countries, and also private standards that are going to impact the ability to participate in global trade. So where do we go from here? I think the U.S. needs to participate more effectively in the international standard setting process, and we see that especially the EU is really adept at doing that. We need to become more actively engaged early on. We need to engage in building scientific capacity building, managing our image of our industry a lot better. Excuse me. And certainly defending the SPS agreements that we have. In 2009 and beyond, there's certain adjustments that we're making at USMEF. We're starting to pursue a more company-specific focus amongst our customers and better target those markets. We're developing new markets within the markets and intensifying our efforts to move more value cuts. A perfect example is in Japan with beef. With a limited supply, we've started to work with customers to utilize more of the carcass there, so we help make more product available in that market. We're going to do more working with the sales force training in those target markets and certainly focus on displacing share of other countries and increasing the share of U.S. meats in all the markets. Our customers view us differently around the world, and certainly in Korea there's a lot of residual negative activity from the 2008 protests. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, but the older customers are really more trusting of U.S. beef than the younger internet generation that seems to be more skeptical. Fear of the overflow of the negative connection. We have a fear of the overflow of this negative connection between U.S. beef and pork. We're afraid that negative perception of U.S. beef could impact pork consumption from the U.S. And we've seen now where restaurants are really touting the fact that they're serving non-U.S. beef, and they've implemented country of origin labeling in restaurants over there now too, so it's pretty much clearly identifiable. But the economy is still driving their decisions. U.S. beef is certainly more affordable than domestic product and other product from other countries. And so consumers also regard meat as an essential part of the diet. So I think we still do have continued opportunities there in spite of some of the challenges. In 2009, the Korean pork consumer, their priorities in order were really price and taste, brand, and really he didn't have much recognition of country of origin, but this is on the pork side. For beef, where safety is an issue, and a huge one, country of origin is #1 priority, followed by price and freshness and brand. In Japan, the younger consumers in their 30s are increasing their meat consumption. It's a lot higher meat versus fish. So as you get older, there's more fish consumption in some of the older consumers. There is a continued improved perception of pork. They've measured this from 2007 to 2009, and we've seen increases in the number of consumers that think U.S. pork is delicious and the number that say it's a good value. There's certainly an improved perception of U.S. beef safety, and we continue to build on that. Japan is a key pork partner. They're the #1 importer of U.S. pork, over $1.5 billion in 2008. And the U.S. is now the market share leader for imported pork into Japan, trailing only their domestic production. Domestic production was about half of their total pork consumption, and as you can see, the U.S. made up about 20%, far away ahead of all the other importing sources of pork. If you just look at the pork imports, we went from 36% of total imported pork coming from the U.S. in 2007 up to 41% in 2008. In 2009, the Japanese pork consumers, their priorities in order were price and value #1, followed by country of origin, freshness, nutrition, health, and safety. And we recently started a new campaign in Japan that really points out the fact that U.S. pork has been the largest source of imported pork for the last 4 years in Japan. And so we launched this campaign, and we incorporated the U.S. pork seal into the campaign. But what it really does is it thanks customers for making U.S. pork #1. And most consumers don't know that U.S. pork is the #1 volume imported meat in Japan. And by showing U.S. pork is supported by Japanese consumers, the housewives feel that, well, they really feel like they'll choose U.S. beef pork because everyone else is purchasing it. The Japanese mentality is unique, and most people feel more comfortable when they follow what other people are doing. So we're trying to tie on to that fact in Japanese culture. Japan is also a key beef partner. They're the #3 importer of U.S. beef, and prior to 2004, when we found BSE, they were traditionally our #1 customer. $383 million in 2008. So we've overtaken New Zealand in market share, but still trail in Australia. And certainly we're limited by the limited amount of cattle supply available in that 20 months of age market and under. But the U.S. is expanding the supply of the eligible product, and so we should have more available in the future to try to move into Japan. The Japanese beef market, Australia was the biggest one for imports. Domestic production was production was about the same as Australia. As you can see, the U.S. made up 6.5% of their total consumption, still relatively small. And when you look at just beef imports, Australia dominates clearly, but the U.S. is making pretty substantial inroads. In 2009, the beef consumers, their list of priorities, price and value #1, and country of origin, freshness, safety, nutrition, and health, really very similar to pork, not too much difference in Japan. We've started a campaign called the We Care campaign, and it really utilizes producers to address concerns of consumers and show that we care. We really try to tell the story of U.S. beef, and we really need to continue to expand the availability of product in that market because there's certainly demand. We Care is really an example of a campaign that's worked very well. It's really bringing back demand for U.S. product much more than the available supply, and so that's really the limiting factor that we have today. So that's been an overview, I guess, and I want to thank you and appreciate the opportunity to present. Lam?